those of us who are here on site, and our friends and colleagues and peers who are online. I just want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to our seminar this afternoon. Those of you who are listening to us from Nairobi here, our nation's capital, and those who are listening to us from different parts of the world. This is the Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi, in our usual weekly staff seminars. Friends, today we have a very close friend of mine speaking to us, Godfrey Kipsigis Sang. Godfrey Kipsigis Sang. It's interesting that I can forget a name of a friend of mine that I've been with for years, both in the academy and also in many other social spaces. But Godfrey, welcome, both to the department and also to the University of Nairobi. And I know very sure that you are not new here. Now, Godfrey is going to speak to us on a subject that he has entitled Kalenjin Extra-Biblical Legends, an exploration of traditional Myoot law with biblical parallels and their impact on traditional Kalenjin orthodoxy and orthopraxy. That's a slight change from what we had circulated earlier, but it's really more or less one and the same thing. Now, just a brief word about Godfrey. Godfrey is a history researcher, a published author, and a biographer with several titles published locally and internationally. And incidentally, actually one of his latest biographies came out last week. This was launched last week. That's why Godfrey was meant to present here last week, couldn't be here. We had to swap with one of our students who gave us a wonderful presentation. Godfrey works as the head of research at a publishing company and is currently engaged in a project to document ancient, near-modern, and modern Kalenjin history. His research interests include the impact of colonial rule on various communities and has been engaged in documenting historical injustices among the Kipsigis and the Talai people of the Rift Valley. He also has interests in denominational history and has also been a sub-editor and a contributor to the online Encyclopedia of the Seventh-day Adventists. Godfrey studied history at the University of Eastern Africa, Baraton, and has done graduate studies at the local and foreign universities, including the University of Oxford in Kipsigis College in the UK, where he holds an active studentship, where he's currently undertaking his PhD. He has also been a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge, Wolfson College, at the invitation of the Center of African Studies. He also serves as an adjunct lecturer in Modern Kenyan History at the American University in Kenyan semester program. There's a lot I can say about my friend, but for now, let me leave it there. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome Godfrey to speak to us. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ken Mbongi, giving me such illustrious introduction. And I'm so happy today to be here at the University of Nairobi. I walked into this institution in 1999, left in 2001. And I'm very, very happy to be in these new developments, the University of Nairobi Towers, which has been developed in the years since I've been away. It's always very nice coming to these, the oldest university in Kenya, and one of the oldest in East and Central Africa. And of course, a leading institution of higher learning, the Department of History, that has welcomed me to speak today. I am so thankful because this is indeed such a great honor to be here today. Thank you very much. And I have with me a copy of my book that I launched just last week. And for the online viewers and the members of the various historical caucuses that I had invited to join us, I have this for the one student that will ask either a physical question or an online question. And Professor and I will probably determine who will be able to win themselves this new book. The book is available in bookshops now. It is going for 2,500 shillings per copy. Thank you very much. On to the topic and subject of this day. Kalenjin extra-biblical legends, an exploration of traditional Myoot law with biblical parallels and their impacts on Kalenjin orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Now, the big words here, orthodoxy. What is orthodoxy? It's simply what body of beliefs that are held by a community. What is orthopraxy? It's what things that people do, the practice of their beliefs based on their orthodox beliefs or holdings or traditions. So in this particular case, we're actually looking at how certain extra-biblical legends or legends that are having similarity with biblical stories and how they come to these. Now, the reason why we're talking about this is because so many times, and the missionaries came here and edged out Africa and the traditional beliefs of the Africans, terming them as heathenism. But over the years, it has come out to be that there was probably something different about the Africans that we probably had not explored. And a lot of time and research effort has been expended in connecting the belief patterns of the Judeo-Christian or the Judaic or maybe Abrahamic faiths, whichever term you like, that is either Islam or Christianity or Judaism, but very little has been done on the African faith. So I'll read the abstract straight so that we are together on the same page. In the course of history, religious propositions about the all-determining divine reality is generally measured against experienced and accepted canonical text. It therefore seems necessary to the present-day historian to construct rationally the truth claims of present Christian theology so that an educated judgment can be formed to the question, to what extent does the understanding of God in a particular religion illuminate to the satisfaction of its adherents within the meaning structure of human experience and history in such a way as to make plausible to claim that this same God is indeed the same as that observed outside the accepted scripture and followed by others who do not share the same faith tradition. This question requires a hermeneutical investigation into biblical roots of the Christian theological thought while seeking parallels with other non-Christian faith traditions. While considerable effort has been used to discuss the similarities of the Judeo-centric faiths, among them Christianity, Islam, and the Jewish faith, very little effort has been used to discuss and to describe elements of similarities found in African folklore. Christian theological thought concentrates on such processes by which doctrine is based and which generally revolves around the concept of sola scriptura. This concept holds the Bible as the infallible sole authority of faith. It outrightly rejects any extra-canonical or extra-biblical thought in our case, or ideas or teachings, or at best holds with skepticism that which does not conform to or is in strict adherence of biblical script. A religious proclamation or teaching is therefore acceptable only if it can be plausibly measured against and be found to conform to accepted scripture. Scholars so given that much of African theological thought has largely been passed down through oral tradition, it has largely been ignored by scholars. This paper attempts to answer the question as to whether the concept of God in the Judeo-Christian understanding existed in other non-Abrahamic faith traditions, in particular the Kalenjin, and whether the knowledge informs their orthodoxy and their orthopraxy as observed at present. Now, when the Christian missionaries arrived in Africa, they quickly held African folklore and cultural precepts in abhorrence and identified them to be as part of that which hindered their efforts to spread their version of the Christian faith. By examining a Akan culture of Ghana and the Bible side by side, Dr. Youngson uncovered some startling facts that he presented in the book, Africa Roots in God, the knowledge of the true God embedded in the indigenous African culture. In this book, Dr. Youngson, a Ghanaian, attempts to answer the following questions. Does Africa have a biblical connection? Did Africa have a theology of creation? Did our African ancestors have a concept of God? Did Africa know God before the arrival of the European missionaries? Did God know Africa? Is Christianity a white man's religion? And more importantly, to me particularly, or to us today, what indigenous African cultural principles do we find in conformity with the Bible? These, in his book, he attempts to debunk what he terms as the myth of African paganism, which he claims was only used to justify slavery. But I agree with him. In short, Dr. Youngson attempts to find a comparative justification of similarities of African orthodoxy and orthopraxy in the Judeo-Christian faith traditions. Early African missionaries among the Kalenjins in particular expended time and their energies in disparaging Kalenjin culture. It's very well documented in so many places. And with that, the coming of Stuart M. Bryson, the Africa Inland missionary at Kapsabet, who wrote in his aptly titled book, Light in Darkness, it was the concept of light in darkness, which title serves to shed light, so to speak, to the attitude of the missionary to the African culture. This disapproving attitude led, or rather had the effect of associating Kalenjin cultural teachings and oral literature with heathenism. It was later historians, such as Alfred Matson, who, almost by accident, discovered certain uncanny parallels in Kalenjin mythology with that of biblical teachings. In his earlier writings, Matson had extensively explored how the Nandi people resisted the British between the years 1895 and 1906. He had also looked at how they had shunned foreign religions in the early years of their contact with the alien races. While the Nandi resistance lasted until 1906, by that time, European missionaries had already penetrated other communities, except the Nandi. It was not until 1909 that the Anglicans became the first Christian missions among the Nandi, setting up at a disused government property in Kaptumo in southern Nandi. 5 years later, the Anglicans abandoned their mission, for little progress had been made, whereupon they handed over their enterprise to the African Inland Mission. Matson, who was an amateur historian based in Nandi Hills, out of curiosity, explored Kalenjin mythology and discovered some biblical parallels which had seemingly been among them before the missionaries, long before the missionaries arrived. In December 1961, he published the article Biblical Stories in Tribal Legends, in which he explored parallels on, among others, the Samson and Delilah story in legend of Luanda Magere and among the Luo, and also the legend of Chibuka among the Baganda. You can see that from Matson of 1961. Welcome, sir. Yes. So who are the Kalenjin? The Kalenjin are an Nilo-Hamitic people, a part of a diverse language group consisting today of more than 11 dialects, collectively referred to in their Proto-Kalenjin name as Kota Myoot, or simply Myoot. That's what a good professor read at the title, Myoot. So I will use the Proto-Kalenjin name of this group known as the Myoot to describe them. The name came into disuse at the coming of colonial rule. The lack of knowledge of African lingual groups by the early colonials caused them to be lumped in the amorphous group known as the Nandi-speaking people, quote unquote, with the name Kalenjin, meaning I say to you, replacing only this name after the Second World War. This name is associated with a group of high school students at Alliance who wanted a name to describe their common dialects. And these dialects included the Nandi, the Kipsigis, the Keyo, the Marakwet, Tugen, Pokot, Sabaot, Sebei, Terik, Bongomek, Ogiek, among others. Wandiba, 1985, states that a number of Proto-Kalenjin groups, particularly the Bok, Bongomek, and Tachoni, are believed to have come under assimilative pressure by their Bantu neighbors. Vestiges of their origins can still be observed in the naming traditions and other cultural precepts of the Proto-Kalenjin days. Today, the Kalenjin people largely occupy the portions of the middle highlands of the Western Rift, the eastern region of Uganda, and the colonial period migrants to northern Tanzania. The Kalenjins are believed to have originated from northern Africa, and according to Sambu 2007, points that as ancient Egypt, where they adopted the practice of multi-gender circumcision and became the first, and for many years, the only Hamitic ethnic group that practiced the rite in Eastern Africa. There are those who argue that they probably originated beyond Africa, perhaps in the immediate Middle East, in the regions between or around the Sinai Peninsula. But it is also possible that they had migrated there as part of their nomadic pastoralist heritage. In this paper, we shall examine the Kalenjin folklore through biblical parallels, among them the creation story, the biblical Abraham, his Kalenjin equivalent Jeruse, the removal from the Egyptaic bondage, and the biblical Moses and his Kalenjin equivalent Kipsoroi. And we'll also discuss the biblical account of the birth of Christ, the refuge in Egypt, and also the biblical account of the passion of the Christ and his Kalenjin equivalent Surumbo. Karibu sana. That was just the introduction. Now, let's go to the story of creation. In 1978, an Orthodox missionary stationed for many years in southern Nandi, among the Terik people, wrote the following and says, in the beginning, God created a man named Chi. This name translates to person. Okay. Now, God then gave Chi a wife, and they had many children. The story continues. Due to a famine, they had to move to a new country, and they traveled east and went into a land of giants. There, one man a day was eaten by those giants. There was a young boy who was given a dream by God behind the sun. And according to the belief that the sun was God's eye looking upon his people. As a result of this dream, the boy led the people out of the giants' country. When the giants realized that the slaves had escaped, they became angry and pursued the people. As the people were following the boy, they realized, as the people were following, the boy realized that the giants were chasing them. And they began to complain to the boy bitterly and saying that we were better off in the land of the giants, because the giants ate only one man a day, but now the giants are angry and they're going to destroy all the people. So everyone was going to suffer. The fleeing people came to a river and were trapped between the giants on the one end, pursuing them, and the river. So the boy spoke to the river as God had directed him and said, "O river of my ancestors, spread apart." And the river obeyed, and all the people passed through. But when the giants reached the river, the boy called the river to close, and the giants were drowned. It was written in 1978 by an Orthodox minister, as explained to him by an old man among the Terik whom he had interviewed. Now, the account is a fusion of the biblical creation story and that of the removal of the Israelite nation from bondage in Egypt. Both accounts narrated in the book of Genesis tie in with the Kalenjin monotheistic religion, which has Egyptaic similarities. That is the sun god Isis, among the Kalenjin also known as, among the Egyptians known as Isis or Isis. In the story of their origin, the Myoot start with a monohomic man. That is the one-man origin, okay? So the story is monohomic in the sense that it begins with a one man, which is similar again to the biblical account of the creation of Adam. Now, God creating the first man, and in this case, the Kalenjins named him as Chi, which meaning is an individual person or man, not in the gender-specific form, but with a male attribute. And this name is similar to the Hebraic Adam. And if I had my slides, I'm sorry I don't, Professor. Meaning an individual or species of mankind. That is the name Adam, which ties very closely to the name Chi. The name Chi has, through semantic drift, that is a change of meaning over the years, come to signify not just someone, but rather humankind in general. In this account, the release from the Egyptaic bondage is characterized by giants who are cannibalistic, a reference that recurs in similar stories also mentioned ahead in this paper. And the reason for their migration to their new land is cited as famine, which seems to agree with the biblical story of Jacob and his family moving to Egypt due to the famine. The giants then enslaved the people who secretly plotted to escape. The daily killing of the people by the giants seems to suggest the tribulation of the Israelites prior to the departure from Egypt, and which, according to this account, led the people to resort to escape. This account omits the name of the leader, but states that he was a boy who was given a dream by God about the tribulations of the people. According to the biblical account, the vision-like encounter by Moses as he tended the sheep in the wilderness, where he saw a burning bush from which he received the calling, seems to mirror the calling of the Myoot narrative. When the boy successfully releases the people from bondage, they reached a body of water, which they could not cross. And the people bitterly complained to the boy, saying that it was better that they remained in bondage, where the giants killed only one person a day. And in the biblical account, of course, they came to the Red Sea, and seeing the pursuing Pharaoh army, the Israelites likewise complained to Moses that it had been better, quote unquote. This is from Exodus chapter 14, verse 12, says, for it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness, end of quote. The Myoot account said the lad then spoke to God, who immediately parted the water, and the people crossed over. The enemy saw also entered the parted section of the water in hot pursuit, But then the Lord spoke, and the water, referring to the water of my ancestors, quote unquote, and the water came together, drowning the pursuing army. And drowning the pursuing enemy. We know from biblical account that Moses was already of advanced age, that is 80 to be precise, when he was led out to the people. Perhaps the reference to the boy in Moses would have been from his previous occupation as a shepherd in his father-in-law's place at Midian, somewhere in Africa, East Africa. Secondly, the removal from the Egyptaic bondage. There's a slight variation to the above account. In this case, in this other Myoot narrative, a boy found himself in the land of ogres, known as Kaptimosin. And then he was captured by a three-eyed ogre and readied for eating. He planned his escape by planting symbols, in this case, the Kalenjin name, I don't know what that means, but noise-making symbols, in strategic places to echo a response should the ogre call out to him. Then he would hear these things making the noise, so he would aptly respond. So the ogre is said to have invited his friends to feast on the boy. But due to the boy's trickery, he was delayed from finding out that the boy had already escaped. So as soon as the ogre learned of the escape, he immediately gave chase. But while at his escape, the boy came upon a huge river, which he could not cross. And at this point, the boy then spoke to the river saying, I know ne kap mama, lesa tami bitanin ilekirging. Translated, this river of my maternal uncles, part, I say once, and once I've crossed, come together. And that is transliterated because there's a lot of hidden meaning in what the gentleman, the boy was saying. So the river parted and the young man crossed. And as soon as the ogre, who was in hot pursuit, crossed the parted river, he got to the middle of it and the water came together and he was swept away by the river. Similarity of the biblical account comes in the parting of the water at the crossing and the destruction of the pursuing enemy. While this account does not include a large group of people moving together, neither does it depict the pursuing enemy as a group, but rather as an individual. Nevertheless, the pursuing enemy is destroyed by the water, and that is the second similarity. A third and near similar variation of the Egyptaic removal refers to the characteristic Myoot nomadic pastoralism, in which this time the Myoot people are said to have moved to a wild country, quote unquote, in which they encountered man-eating giants who ruled over them and ate one person each day. It's very, very close to the first one. But in this particular account, they say that one of the elders, now this is not a boy, but an elder this time, known as Musaiga, secretly led them out, and the people left with their belongings. But as they reached a lake, this is a lake now, not a river, they could not cross due to the depth. And at this point, the elder Musaiga commanded the water 4 times, saying, "Peg up ka mama. Yas uleyas," meaning that waters of my maternal uncles, which again reflects to the first story. Part, I say part, and the water consequently parted, and it so doing, they reached the other side, and once there, this instruction came that big up ka mama, king ole king, water of my maternal uncles, meat, I say meat. By this time, the giants had already crossed into the water, still in hot pursuit, but the water meeting destroyed the giants instantly. So the parting of the waters and the mirrors the biblical account of the Exodus story. The slight variation would be the natural changes, can be attributed to the natural changes in oral tradition over the long years and obvious absence of written narrative. So the story of the liberation also moves on to a certain gentleman now called Kipsigis. And this same story follows the same path that Kipsoroi, this time now has changed from being named Musaiga, and of course Musa, you can find the name Musa or Moses in that name. But Kipsoroi now, this time, is the counter of Musaiga. This fourth narrative, Kipsoroi is said to have been a young lad that did wonderful things, published by Towet in 1979. He says that Kipsoroi then one time lived in a land of cannibals who wanted to kill him. And he reached a massive river and found himself unable to cross. Again, Kipsoroi then encountered over the water, and this time offered the water beads, black and white beads. Says, waters of my ancestors, I will give you a white and a black bead if you part. And the story goes that indeed the waters parted. And then in this particular narrative now, the only difference with the others is that there was a song at the end of it all, which was saying that if it were not for the ridge, if it was not for the ridge of Musaiga, again Kipsoroi, but this time it is Musaiga being sung about, we would not have been in this land. Now, a very close resemblance. Of course, the name Moses and Kipsoroi are totally different, but Kipsoroi in its real name means a little shepherd, a shepherd boy. A shepherd is somebody who, Kipsoroi is more or less a shepherd. So it brings in the connotation of a little boy, which appears in the other two narratives that we've mentioned, but also at the same time seems to mirror the occupation that Moses had at the time immediately prior to him being called to liberate the Israelite nation. Now, finally, in the legend of Kipsoroi, it said that he arrived at the mountain, and when he told the Kalenjin people that I shall not go with you to the land beyond here which you shall occupy, but I shall return to go and liberate other people. And so it said that Kipsoroi, arrived in what we know presently as Mount Elgon, and which was the point of dispersal for the various Kalenjin communities. Moving very fast, and I hope we have questions that are lined up. We move now to the next legend of Abraham and Jeruse. So away from the liberation narratives, there is a legend of the biblical Abraham, which according to this story, there was an elder named Jeruse. Now, his elder decided that one day he was going to eat, quote unquote, his child. So the story goes that he led his son to a far-off country and then up a mountain where he lit a huge fire. And the legend has that the son, so he told the son that he is going to eat him. And in this particular legend, the son actually escapes, which is the departure from when Isaac and Abraham scaled up the mountain and were up there where he wanted to eat him. So in present day, you would find many people say, why have you lit a fire? If somebody lights maybe a big fire, says, why have you lit a fire? Like that fire which Jeruse wanted to eat his son with, and which is part of that narrative. Now to the sixth, I think, I've lost count, is a biblical account of Christ. Now we're coming to Christ, Jesus Christ. So in this particular one, the story goes that a man, and this I was told by a very respectable old man in the community, said that night fell upon a man who was traveling to a distant country. And as he lay his head somewhere for the night, he had a vision and saw upon the open sky a man walking behind a donkey and moving westward. As he was walking behind a donkey which carried a woman and a child in the arms. At dawn, the man continued with his journey, and yet the night fell upon him, and he needed a place to sleep. As he slept, he saw, again in the sky, the same old man walking, this time to the opposite direction, eastward, with a donkey behind him and a young boy, this time walking together with the old man. But the donkey sat a woman as they headed eastward. So he inquired, what was this dream about? And he was told that the little boy was known as Masiya, and which name had been given to the place where the sighting had first been seen as Masiya, which is the pre-colonial name of the Tugen people. Now, this is the first of the stated legends which crosses to the New Testament period, giving their dream to a close resemblance of the flight to Egypt by Joseph and Mary to protect the infant Jesus from the wrath of Herod. In the biblical account, Joseph is instructed by an angel in a dream and commanded to flee to Egypt. After several years in Egypt, the family returned to Palestine, but rather than return to Bethlehem, whence they came, they settled in Nazareth, where Christ continued to live. Now, it is instructive to note that this account of the flight to Egypt was only narrated by Matthew and no other of the Gospels. Maybe you didn't know that. And who is the presumed author of the first book of the New Testament? The stated similarity of this legend with that of the Kalenjin and the specificity of the name Messiah in reference to Christ as Messiah, that is Mashiach, in the Hebrew text, seems to suggest that the Myoot people had already understood the messiahship of Christ, even at the tender age at which he briefly resided in Egypt. This specific legend, though, seems to raise more questions than answers. While the birth of Christ is fairly recent occurrence compared to the freedom from the Egyptian bondage, if indeed the Myoot had already migrated to their present land, ostensibly through the hand of Moses, then how come they understood an event that happened nearly several hundred years later? This calls to question our understanding of the interactions of the people of Africa with those of the Middle Eastern region, despite the vast differences involved. Finally, we come to the biblical story of Christ and Surumbo. Surumbo, among the Nandi, the legend of Surumbo among the Nandi reflects aspects of the life of Christ, in particular, the Passion. And narrating to this author, Mzee Simeon Leting of Chepterit in Nandi County, say that a long time ago, a man named Surumbo did something that offended the elders of the community. They judged and sentenced him that he should die. Now the people came together and killed him on a hill and buried him right there. After a few days, a huge bull, so the story goes, with big horns, came and dug up Surumbo. And he came out of his grave alive and well. Children who were around the hill saw Surumbo get up and walk away, and he was never seen again. Now, the biblical account of the death of Jesus is very well captured in the Gospels, and the Kalenjin legend seems to capture several points of similarities. These included the actions of Surumbo, which offended the laws and the consequent judgments, and the role of the elders in the judgment and the sentencing to death of the said offender. There is also the death on a hill and the burial that followed. And in the biblical account, it was the Sanhedrin of the Jewish council of priestly elders that carried out the trial and sentencing of Christ. The actions of the Sanhedrin in condemning Jesus to his death is discredited by the followers of Christ, and the entire trial is deemed patently unjust, leading to the shedding of innocent blood of the Christ. Kalenjin narrative here seems to be silent on the opinion as to the fairness or otherwise of the trial, and seems to suggest, albeit silently, that Surumbo deserved what he got. Perhaps the naming of the elders being the ones condemning Surumbo imputes in them some level of infallibility, being that the Kalenjin societies were and still are in many ways patriarchal and gerontocratic. Some scholars have questioned the historicity of the biblical account of the Passion of the Christ, explaining that it seems to reflect the hostile attitudes of the early Christian converts towards the Sanhedrin. Another important parallel is the coming back to life of the said Surumbo, and the witness by certain people, in this case children, and this therefore conjoins the story with that of the risen Christ. And in Kalenjin context, the term children or lago, usually a generic term, and this is controversial, which is used to refer to both adult women and their children together. And the fact that he was never seen again mirrors also the biblical account of the Assumption of Christ. So there's a similar thing, who is still alive and is now 98 years old, remembers the story as narrated to him by his grandmother in the late 1920s when he was about 5. He said that she never joined any Christian denomination, neither did she in her entire life become a Christian. In fact, Liting himself only became a Catholic in the 1940s while attending the Catholic school at Chepterit in central Nandi, founded by the Mill Hill missionaries in 1936. In his explanation, quote, Surumbo, the name comes from Surumbe, which is the name of the umbilical cord, and which seems to suggest the principal functions of the incarnated Christ that is connecting God to humankind. Questions? Now, the big question in the place is the place of unorthodox literature, written or oral, and its place in shaping the character of the faiths that we know today. While some may argue that the findings affirm the authenticity of the scriptures, in perhaps the same way the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947 affirmed most of what was already canon, the next question is, or rather, the next question that must be answered is whether these extra-biblical legends are an affirmation of hitherto obscure evidence of the Myoot North African origins, or perhaps they are merely the evidence of the peripheral interaction with ancient Middle Eastern traditions, which they adapted into their folklore. These legends span the two testaments, that is, in the biblical accounts, and which inform patterns of interactions between the Proto-Kalenjin groups and other groups of Northern Africa and Eastern Africa as well. Perhaps more straightforward question has been whether these extra-biblical legends are also present in other communities. Dr. Youngson, in this particular case, states that it has expanded considerable Dr. Youngson, who has expanded considerable effort in proving this among the Akan people of present-day Ghana. Conclusion. The conceptual commonalities in the extra-biblical stories add to the rich tapestry of voices that shape our understanding of the origins and spread of religious understanding among the Africans. It is yet evidence that Africa had clear awareness of the Judeo-Christian faith tradition way before the coming of the European missionaries, who did not know that they were speaking of what was already known, perhaps not with the same clarity as their own voice. In his 2016 BBC lecturer, BBC Reef Lecture Series, Professor Kwame Appiah, in one of his lectures entitled Creed, distinguishes the parts of religious practice. He says that every religion has 3 dimensions. That is, the things that we believe and the things that we do. Things that we believe is now what we know as orthodoxy, and the things that we do is orthopraxy. And the 3rd dimension that he states here is what we do with these 2, okay? That is what we believe and what we practice and who we practice with. And that term I have given koinonia, or community, or if you like, that place where we practice what we believe in. This was, of course, in line with the various contradictions that are found in both the Christian faith and traditional African beliefs. So in many ways, the missionaries were quick to protect their communities by clearly demarcating the boundaries of belief, emphasizing very well, emphasizing orthodoxy and orthopraxy in strict conformity with scriptural precepts as they understood it. There was therefore no window open for ideas outside their own stated beliefs. One inevitable struggle, which still continues to present times, between the European missionaries and the Africans was the conflict of orthopraxy and African cultural beliefs, such as polygyny, and the insistence on monogamic practices that reflected the Eurocentric ideas of family. This subject continues to cause a lot of controversy, which I don't want to wade into, as it is outside the scope of this paper. Finally, the Kalenjin extra-biblical legends are by no means exclusive to the Kalenjins. Matson in 1961 noted the legend of Chibuka among the Baganda as being close to that of Samson and Delilah. He also states that the Luanda Magere story too is close to the Samson and Delilah story. In yet another, the Akan traditions of present-day West Africa, Ghana, particularly the Ashanti, seem to have adopted Judaic practices such as the veneration of the seventh-day Saturday and observing it as their day of worship. Indeed, the Akan extra-biblical orthopraxy quickly found rooting in the Seventh-day Adventist theological thought and is probably one of the rare circumstances where missionary-led denominations were in alignment with African traditional orthopraxy. You can see that from Osei Bonso of 2012. While the Kalenjins had these extra-biblical legends, they did not merely exist outside their orthopraxy and orthodoxy. Circumcision, which is thought to have been adopted by the Kalenjins from their Judaic traditions, is perhaps one enduring orthopractic element of the traditional Kalenjin religion. Unlike the Judaic tradition, the traditional circumcision among the Kalenjin became heavily ritualized, and water is central to the rite. During the process, initiations are made to cross a body of water, symbolizing the crossing made by their ancestral folk described in legends. You can see Langley, 1979. And there's evidence of the impact of the legends in Kalenjin orthopraxy. Thank you. Thank you. I will. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Wow, that is quite interesting stuff, and also I should say, an eye-opener. I'm hearing things that I only expect to hear in purely Christian spaces. Welcome, Mzee Kimalat, for joining us in our seminar today, and it's good to have you here. And we are glad that our series of seminars is attracting people like yourself with a very rich experience, not just in public service, but also in many social spaces in and around our country. So, Mzee, welcome. We are happy to have you here. Friends, you know, as I listened to Godfrey speak, and I want to believe that perhaps a number of theologians have joined us online. I made an attempt to invite a number of our pastors to join in, including Pastor Jean-Pierre Mayo, who I thought would be interested in such discourse, given his interests in his PhD. So I hope they will bring their ideas to bear on this when we start our discussion. But nevertheless, I hear Godfrey saying broadly three things. One, he seems to provide us with what I see as an antithetical argument to the often warped and Eurocentric notions that there was no religion in Africa until Christianity dawned on our doors. And he seems to argue that Kalenjin folklore themes with stories, oral narratives that are akin to biblical stories, stories of creation, stories of the Exodus and crossing of the Red Sea. It was interesting to listen to Godfrey talking about the creation of chi, very well elaborated in the legends that he has talked about, where chi stands for man. Very interesting if you juxtapose that with the story of creation in the book of Genesis. Number two, he has put Kalenjin legends, you know, side by side with biblical narratives. And he gives a very interesting portrait of what one could easily describe as Kalenjin monotheism that has almost complete resonance to the Abrahamic traditions reflected in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In other words, I have a feeling that it's almost talking about Kalenjin religion and the Abrahamic traditions on the same footing. This is something that will be very interesting to theologians and probably the only teachers of the law in Israel in Christ's time. Then number three, he seems to suggest that there was a very profound awareness of notions very akin to Judeo-Christian biblical narratives of the Old Testament in Kalenjin extra-biblical legends. I know that those of us who are here and those listening to us online, you could be having some observations and comments, but I really will want to emphasize that we are history scholars. This is not theology. This is we are having a historical discourse and looking at a phenomenon that affects very directly our lives. So with that, friends, I now want to open up this to the audience here on site. And I want to hear your questions to Mr. Sang, comments, opinions, observations, and then thereafter, we will go online. Let me see, who will be the first one to throw the stone? Who will throw the first stone? Yes, Mwalimu Ngeza.
Do I stand?
Yes, please, if you can,
Okay.
at least for the sake of the cameras.
I thank you very much, Geoffrey. That was a very, very good presentation. I think it has enlightened us on a number of issues. And it was nice to listen to you. Mine is actually not a question, or rather, I think I have one question, and then one is just a comment. You talked about an Anglican mission which kind of failed to take off, and the people had to sell the place to some, is it the Inland Mission or something? Yes. Could that have had, could that have happened because the Kalenjins already knew what they believed in and they were just being told the same in another way? I don't know. And then I like talking about women. And as you did the parallels, I didn't hear you talk about any woman, and we have so many of them in the Bible. Thank you so much.
That's a good one. Yes, Dr. Gona.
Godfrey, customarily, legends are told as true in quotes and quotes. They're told as true stories. Legends often contain supernatural, bizarre, or highly improbable elements. To what extent, in terms of juxtaposing the biblical and the Kalenjin legends, did you identify any unbelievable legends, both in the Bible and from the Kalenjin point of view?
Thank you. Next. Yes, Dr. Gajehe.
Thank you very much. That's a very complex subject in my view. It may sound, it is complex indeed, but very interesting, and I would like to thank our speaker. Mine is not really a question, it's more of a follow-up and maybe a commentary on what he has said. And I would really be more interested in the conclusions that therefore withdraw from these parallels between extra-biblical legends and folklore. And I think there's a suggestion here that there are some fundamental commonalities that grounds all beliefs, regardless of where they are found. And perhaps we expend a lot of energy trying to look for the similarities, whereas perhaps they've grown in a parallel manner. If you know what I mean, like civilizations can grow parallel without, probable influence at times. And then again, there's a lot of literature around this. I'm thinking of, for example, Judith Bahemuka, who has written on the hidden Christ in African religion. We have the theologian Waligo, who has written on African Christology in a situation of suffering. Our very own Jesse Mugambi has several works around the same subject. So my question is, what's the common denominator in all this? Is there some sort of appropriation, appropriating these legends for a very particular use? I know, for example, in the Mau Mau, the Bible was very central to the struggle, right? As it was to Christians who would not join Mau Mau because they argued in the so-called exile motive, the Jews in Babylon, which said that, build and do not destroy. Where the Lord has taken you, build, do not destroy. So in a colonial situation, Christians would argue they're under colonialism, but they are called to build and not destroy, the so-called exile motive. So again, I'm following up on the kind of conclusions we want to draw from these parallels. The other one is Karanja, John Karanja, in his work Founding an African Faith, in which he very persuasively argues that, for example, the Kikuyu response to an appropriation of Christianity actually derived its force and vitality from indigenous models and experiences. So, Mr. Sang, very, very fascinating subject, and perhaps what I'm following through is that we have some synergy here, between a lot of things, which perhaps you'd like to comment on as we look at these parallels, or what we call parallels between these legends and in our folklore. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gachie. Quite a mouthful of issues there. Yes, any other? Yes, there is a gentleman at the back. Kindly introduce yourself and proceed.
Yes, I'm Edwin.
Yeah, if you could kindly stand so that the cameraman can see you.
So I'm Edwin Kibunge. I come around those side. I come around the Nandi side. So the presentation was quite insightful. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Geoffrey. I only have two questions here. The first one is you talked about the legend of Surumbo, who lived in Chepterit. Actually, I come almost around those sides. You said that he was charged and sentenced. So my question is, what did he actually commit, and was it a serious crime which was worth sentence? So my second question is, was Surumbo coined from the umbilical code name Surumbet? That's my question. Then the last one is, what was the role of Surumbo according to your presentation, and what is its significance according to the context of your presentation? Kindly elaborate. Thank you.
Very good. With very interesting anecdotes, because the gentleman comes from some of the areas that featured in your presentation. Any other last one? Okay. If there is no other question, so you want to contribute? Oh, okay, fine, please.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Yes.
You hear?
Yes, we are hearing.
Yeah.
you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you, Dr. Sang, for inviting me to this and this university, which long time ago, one of our peers, I used to come here to make sure things are okay financially and otherwise. This presentation is good. It gives us a new insight into what we ought to do to look into the relationship between colonialism and our traditional beliefs, which in later times, some of them clashed, some of them did not clash. And this parallelism, which Dr. Sang has brought, is very interesting to me. In this way, My question is this: who originated this biblical literature, the Torah, the Pentateuch itself? Where did it, the origin of it, the writing of it, and the relationship between Islam, Judaism or Hebrew, Egypt, Kush, Menro, and the Kalenjin, the Myoot themselves, the Kalenjin group? Were we part of that movement to the extent that we brought the history and culture and behavior and legends, and we broke off from Judaism, Judaistic or Christian beliefs, and came down the Nile with it, to the extent that it is remembered history? We're remembering our origin, and we are remembering also the route which we took, crossing the Sea of the Reeds, Sinai, Moses in Midian, which is in Africa, Kush in Egypt, and all those things which the Myoot community say they took the route from. So were we part of that civilization, and we came down so that we are remembering? It could be remembered history. It was also a diffusion. Was it a diffusion of those practices which we carried and remember, continue to remember up to and including today? Because that story of crossing of the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds was, I remember I was told when I was, I think 50s. And those things which Dr. Sang has mentioned, and it's very good you have captured quite a lot of them. There are others which I thought you could also bring up. That is Kapkoros, the annual Thanksgiving ceremony, which we practiced, and it is recorded in the Old Testament. Similarly, to the extent that when the Christians came to Nandi, some of us were saying, I mean, what are they telling us? I mean, Kapkoros, we must go, and every year, Thanksgiving, marriages at night was okay. I mean, ceremonies are done at night. Boys must be circumcised, and included girls, maybe for other beauty, other reasons. So I consider this presentation an initially good way to look into history now. Yani moving from legend to modern history, which could be quasi-scientific or scientific, but again, an area of belief. Those are my comments, but I think it is just the beginning. That's my contribution. It is just the beginning.
Thank you very much, sir. It is just the beginning. And my friend Sang, you've heard that, history and memory.
Yeah.
Very interesting question from Zé there. And I'll be keen to hear what you say. But I have a few for you, if I may use the idea that I have the mic now. One, talking about parallels between folklore and biblical narratives. Did you manage to find anything, if you checked, the parallels that touch on divinity of these narratives on both sides and the role of faith? Because you see, from a layman's point of view, what makes the difference between the Wusi myths of origin and the biblical myths of origin, to me, is something we call within the realm of Christianity, faith. You know, which is simply the way I was, you know, taught in Sabbath school. You know, believing without seeing. You know, not by sight, but by faith. What's the role of this phenomenon called faith in both narratives, the Kalenjin ones and the Christianity one. And how does divinity come in both, where the godliness of these writings? Because if you look at many traditional conventions, they are held in place by social controls that touch on the metaphysical realm. You are told, for example, you are told, don't sit on a sharpening stone. That is where I come from in my village. You don't sit on a sharpening stone, because if you do, you will grow a bald head. You can't find a connection between that as a child, but you fear that if I do that, then I won't have hair when I grow older. I don't know whether that's what we did. We were fairly naughty when we were growing up. My second question is the whole concept or understanding of the validity of oral traditions. And I'm a student of Jan van Sina, oral traditions as history. And he suggests, and correctly so, that oral traditions are malleable. They are flaxy, and they change with time in terms of their semantics and even syntax. Could it be, and I'm putting it to you, that what we now see as Kalenjin narratives are narratives that are a product of what Mzee called the fusion between Kalenjin narratives and the ones in Christianity that have come to us in ways that appear like they belong to yesteryears. How do you separate the theatrics of memory, which is always out to serve the purposes of the present in a way that the stories we are told, they are presumed to be old, but they are told in such a ways that they serve the purpose, very expedient present. Now, the final one, and as you spoke, I thought about this, is yours an attempt to localize Christianity. Every time I read J.S. Mbiti actually, not Mbiti, J.S. Mbiti, the clergyman come scholar, in his book, African Religion and Philosophy. I've always seen attempts of, understanding the Judeo-Christian traditions and trying very hard to find the equivalents in African religion. And I thought at some point that he seemed to me to have introduced monotheism where there was none. Is that what you tried to do? I mean, there could be parallels, but there is always an influence of one culture over the other. And I have this strong feeling, because we know historically that Christianity in Africa predated the imperial era, the 18th and 19th century imperial era, when Christianity we have today took root in Africa. In fact, if my memory serves me well, one of the earliest bishops of the Christian church in Africa was St. Augustine of Hippo, who is regarded to be African. What is the possibility then, going back to what P.S. Kimalat was asking, that this is simply, memory that has come back to us in ways that suggest them to be contemporary history. I want you to delve into that a little bit, so that we don't find monotheism where probably one did not exist. Thank you very much. Please respond to that, and then we can go online.
Thank you very much, Dr. Umbonge. And for all those who have asked the questions, this is, thank you very much. Now, a quick one. Maybe I'll begin with these as a way of handling all the questions that have arisen. Indeed, this is a very, very controversial subject. When it comes to religion, there are always no hard facts or clear-cut lines between fact of history and fact of faith, all right? In which in this particular case, we will look at the Kalenjin narrative or worldview based on what another's worldview is. And many people have stated in no uncertain terms, particularly those who are not persuaded about religion, have cited a lot of the Old Testament stories as being mere myth or legend, or it was probably the legends of a community that had the advantage of writing. So they were able to actually write, as opposed to those of the communities that were not able to write and who could not create a clear path of memory. So that our discussion today is more like a counter memory. A counter memory in the sense that, is it that what you're telling me is something that I've heard of before? Is it some sort of deja vu where someone said something and you're like, oh, I mean, I've heard that before, or was it really out of fact? So starting with Mwalimu Ngesa, I believe that's the name. Were there any women in this role? Yes, of course, I mentioned that in the biblical account, there was that time when the women were the first to see the risen Christ. And in this particular case, it's the children, in the Kalenjin context, that the children saw were the first ones to see the risen Surumbo. And in Kalenjin context, women and children are usually classed together. So it was probably those were women and children who saw them first. So don't ask me, I wasn't there, but that's the stated fact. Anyway, about the Kalenjin rejecting and the Anglicans spending 5 years of fruitless years. Fruitless 5 years in Kaptumo. They came in 1909, actually in July, a gentleman called Sison and his counterpart there, I forget his name, I'll remember it just now. They set up from a disused government facility. You remember the first place during the resistance was the first capital of, or rather the first headquarters of Nandi at that time was in Kaptumo, which is southern Nandi, before it moved to Kapsabet. So in that particular place, they took one of the government buildings and converted it into a school and a church and asked the Nandis to come there. And there was patent disinterest, complete disinterest. Now, there's people who have explained it this way, that probably to just, the wars, the Nandi resistance wars had only ended like 3 years earlier with the killing of Koitalel. So generally, the Nandi did not want anything to do with Europeans, much less their faith, their denomination. But some explain it that there was nothing new these people were saying. Yeah, they already had that before, that sort of deja vu moment. In this particular case, the missionaries were so desperate that they paid these young people to be in class. And so they gave them money. So they agreed, yes, fine, we will sit in class. Of course, they sat in class, learned nothing. When they were moving to the next class, the young people demanded a raise for being moved from standard 1 to standard 2. and this is very, very interesting, yes, in the sense that 5 years later, and then the missionaries, very interesting, went and said, okay, fine, this is a beautiful agricultural country. We can teach the Nandi a little bit about agriculture. And so let's start an agricultural school. So the missionary Sison moved to Aldai, opened the first demonstration plot. So he asked the Nandis, this is Jembe, dig. Now, Nandis being purely pastoralist and had very clear-cut division of labor, declined to hold a hoe because that was a woman's job. And indeed, they completely refused to do that. And then Sison went across and brought in some Maragolis who very happily dug up the demonstration plot. And the Nandis stood outside there, laughing their hearts out at grown men doing a woman's job. The rest is history. Now, yes, the women are stated there. I don't know whether that satisfies this whole thing, but of course, like we said, this was only the first step. Maybe there's more of the legends that are yet to be discovered, and which will probably give us a close understanding of what the women did in these legends. So Dr. Gona says, the question is, the legends are told as true stories, but of course, they are bizarre stories that are, people have questioned biblical stories and says, bull, something like that could not happen. In fact, the crossing of the Red Sea, this is the Egyptian head of archaeological findings or something like that, seriously questions that there was anything of that kind. I mean, and if indeed there was an Egyptian army that was buried in the sea, at least the sea should be able to give us some evidence of some sort. And so they've questioned that. In the same way, we would probably also question, I mean, how would a young boy offer a white and black bead to the river and tells them, river of my ancestors, river of my maternal uncles, please part ways. Who are these maternal uncles and things like that? So mine is not to come, I mean, it's not to state the veracity of this. Maybe it is actually to question the veracity of the biblical account. Is what the Bible is saying really true? Or is what the Kalenjin is saying really true? Okay, so we want to create this dichotomy that yes, there's this place, but what is the convergence of all this? Very quickly to Dr. Kashia, very interesting comments, and thank you for your suggestions and conclusions. So, what conclusions do we draw from this? Maybe, like I've stated before, maybe perhaps it's time to ask questions now. Do we hold this? Because to me, yes, I mean, there's so many people who have written a lot about the presence and the knowledge of Christ, and in Africa long before this. When I mentioned Dr. Yankson, I mentioned countless scholars who have studied the Akan culture. I mean, of course, the Catholic fathers, of the faith, Tertullian in Alexandria, and we have Augustine of Hippo in Algeria, and all these other, and they themselves have come up with their own narratives and their own situations in this particular sense. So, what conclusions do we draw from this? But from this, yes, there are commonalities. And these commonalities now should help us to bring in more questions. That's why I stated at some point that my presentation today, which is, yes, I mean, at some point I felt like I was addressing a theological class. But yes, it is in history, yes, in the sense that how did these missionaries present to us the denominations? And they presented to us in a way that stated that everything else in this dark continent is pagan. Everything else in this dark continent represents heathenism. So what is the place, or what's the role of heathenism? And was it really true that Africa was this dark continent? So they brought the light. I mentioned how Stuart Bryson wrote a book, Light in Darkness, you know. I mean, it's this particular sense. Yes, of course, the common denominator in all this. So my paper really was trying to find a common denominator between these Christian-led faiths and these legends of the Kalenjin. Yes, to Edwin, thank you very much for that question. I'm glad you understand the language, and probably some of those things that I was mentioning here are familiar to you. Yes, what's the significance of Surumbo? And I stated earlier that, you know, in stated Christian faith is that the purpose of Christ was to come and reunite God to mankind, perhaps to create that umbilical cord, which is so named by the name Surumbo. But why did they choose this? You know, why would they choose this particular name? And why? So did the name inform the actual umbilical cord as we know it among the Kalenjin? So these are questions that I rely on historians like you or anybody who's interested in this particular sense to find out more. To P.S. Kimalat, thank you for honoring the invitation to come. Yes. Indeed, it's true. Perhaps this is a diffusion of practices and understanding from many people across the African continent. In many ways, the African continent was more like a crucible in which it was a melting pot of so many faiths, so many understandings, so many. In fact, it's probably still the continent with the most diverse belief systems. I mean, the Herero, for instance, have their own belief systems. The Kalenjins, as do the Luyas and the Baganda and what, and you know, the diversity is massive. So what do we do in this situation? We look for parallels. We look for situations like this that offer us a counter memory to the issues that the Christian faith had introduced to us, yeah, and which, of course, you know, was a point of conflict between the missionaries and the Africans. Circumcision, for instance. I mean, the first thing that Bryson told the Kalenjins of the Nandis of Kapsabet said, circumcision is useless. You don't have to get circumcised. I am not circumcised, and you call me Bwana. Okay, so the Nandis there. So, of course, a number of them shunned the practice. But after a little bit, they came and said, wait a minute, but Jesus was circumcised. You know? Yeah? How come Jesus himself is circumcised and you're telling us not to do this particular thing? So they were branded as rebels, and it is probably what we are doing here now. We probably will be branded rebels for creating this counter memory towards what the Christian missionaries did. To my good professor and personal friend, Dr. Ken Ombongi, thank you very much for those questions. What's the role of faith in all this? That's why I stated orthopraxy. Orthopraxy actually is faith, okay? It's the exercise of faith. How do you behave in such a manner that you're reflecting the teachings of the orthodoxy, okay? So this is the orthodoxy and orthopraxy, which is the faith, okay? So what is your faith? Faith is what you're stating. Sit on a sharpening stone, you will not do this. Fail to do this, this will happen to you. So you have that faith ingrained in you, and it has determined the way you do your things. Case in point. I don't know, I mean, why people, for instance, when, say, they want to go on a journey, you know, they see a black cat in front of them, you know. They say, no, that's a bad omen. So, of course, so you turn around and go back because you saw a cat on the way. So you have come to practice what your ancestors had told you about this, and has informed your way of thinking. I was questioning at some point, I attended a funeral not so long ago, and Kalenjin funeral says, oh, you know, the head must face the east, the rising sun. I said, how did that come to be? Because the Kalenjins did their first funeral in 1927, the first burial in 1927, that an individual was put in a dug hole. As prior to that, Kalenjins interred their dead in the bush, which was an honorable death. If you were eaten up by the hyenas and converted into manure, which will grow the grass and the cows will eat and the children will drink the milk, that's an honorable death. So why have we come to this? So in a way, we are looking at diffusion, so that so many other beliefs from other faith traditions have come to inform the orthopraxy of the present times. Why do people shave their hair when somebody dies? I mean, what's the link between the death of that person and the shaving of the hair? So in a way, we're creating this as a way of questioning some of these faith traditions. I've mentioned here about polygamy. Perhaps in the Kalenjin understanding of polygamy, whatever you want it, you choose to, there were certain justifications that were at odds with the Judeo-centric, or rather, if you like, the Eurocentric views that the missionaries had. So how does this understanding of Kalenjin orthopraxy and orthodoxy challenge those Eurocentric beliefs and practices and teachings? Your second question was about the concept of understanding of oral traditions, separating the theatrics of memory. Of course, yes, it's close. I mean, Vansina is very clear about that. Vansina states that, you know, over time, that's why I stated there's always, like in language, there's the semantic drift, where a word begins to have a different meaning over the years. I'll tell you the origin of the word mama, okay? While we have popularly thought it means the place where my mother came from, he said that it means mama. You know, mama in Kalenjin language means that they did not expose me. Okay, that's his explanation. I was not exposed. I was not put out there to dry. I was not, so that when you were in total trouble, you went to the one person who will never put you out to dry, will always have your back, will always listen to you, okay? That's now the meaning of ka mama. Has nothing to do with where your mother. In any case, and I agreed with him because the word mama, for instance, is as, I mean, not quite Kalenjin in itself, because they had their own names for their own mother, which is not this one. It is very Bantu, mama, okay? It's not Nilo-Hamitic or Kalenjin for that particular matter. So the whole concept of ka mama is about the person that I turn to in the times of trouble. So in this particular case, yes, Kalenjins are very highly patriarchal, all right? And they follow the patriarchy. But see, the women in terms of crisis, particularly when the humiliating defeat at the end of the Nandi resistance and the killing of Koitalel, the women began to reverse the gains of the Kalenjin patriarchy. They began to now start to stand among themselves and created matriarchal lines. And the two of us, Dr. Ombongi, we have done this, and Kimalat. We've talked about the migration, the urban migration of Kalenjin women. Perhaps we could, if you call me again, next time I promise it will not be a religious discussion, to be purely history. We were able to discover certain patterns that came with the end of the resistance war. The women now began to claim their own space and created matriarchal lines, which are still there up to this day, taking back the cruelty of the Kalenjin patriarchy. Yes, nani kama mama. is the one person you turn to when you're in total trouble. And of course, that same line and the people standing behind her are equally as friendly. Parallels of African religion and the quest for commonality. Who did this? Okay. This is my good friend. Thank you. Yes, we met. I remember you very well at the launch of this book, Paul Boyer's book. I was the reason why I wasn't able to do my presentation last week, and thanks to the department for accommodating my my having to be in another function at that particular time. Now, this particular says, what was the quest for commonality between the African religions and the traditional? It is indeed, and I quoted Dr. Taita Towet, who began, we can say is the first published author among the Kalenjins, in the sense of the scholarly aspects. So he brings out this legend of Kipsigis, which I actually quoted here. The legend of Kipsigis, I read about it from 1979 publishings of Dr. Taita Towet, and he's the first one probably who sought a proper commonality. In fact, in his footnote about the same thing, he says this story is like that of Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. And so, of course, that is one person who has done this. But of course, the others who have probably done it in a more scholarly manner, who were mentioned to us earlier by our good professor, who have done what Africa knew about Christ, or rather Christ before, or Jesus, or the African religion as we know it before the coming of the Europeans. So in this particular sense, yes, there are many people who have sought commonality, many people who have sought the divergence, the points of divergence, and indeed, this paper could be just one of them. It's probably the beginning, and it's a challenge to particularly those interested in the study of the history of religion, particularly the missionary-led religion, to look through this. And as stated by my good professor, religion is one area of great fascination to myself, and of course to you. I know we've had these kind of discussions, trying to challenge the belief systems that were handed down to us by missionaries and stated that under no uncertain terms, this is the truth, and anything else divergent from this is error. Concept of sola scriptura. So do we take sola scriptura as the gospel truth? Or can we also say, okay, there's sola scriptura, but can we also look at what other people thought and believed? And how can we be able to merge these things? So did their views change over time? Of course, it begins with papers like this, begins with presentations like this, that we help one another to question our own belief systems, and whether we can be able to say, okay, this is the situation, this is what. Did we move away? Because this is one, the Africans have been accused heavily of moving away or abandoning their religion almost completely. Remember Rishi Sunak, the new Prime Minister of England, performing rituals outside the door, performing Hindu rituals outside the door of 10 Downing Street. You know, lighting candles and, you know, making some incantations and, you know, yes, and yes. And painting something on the door above and all these things. And these are the same things. If you have seen an Indian starting a new shop, he does exact same things many thousands of kilometers away. So I was asking myself, supposing an British African, was prime minister, would he have done the same things? Would Obama have said, called on the ancestors of the Luo, for instance, at the White House, saying, "Oh, Ramogi, Ramogi, here I come, your son, your illustrious son. I've come to occupy the most powerful seat. Be my right hand because you are a great warrior." I mean, would he have done that? So we want to see whether these kind of things are going to help us to rekindle our old tradition, which we abandoned at the altar of the Christian faith, particularly that which was led to us and handed down to us by the missionaries. Thank you so much.
Well, that is very interesting. Talk of Prime Minister Sunak doing probably Yachna outside Downing Street number 10. That's a fire sacrifice. Yes, Mzee wants to make the very last comment. Yes.
Thank you very much. I know you have finished and we are supposed to wind up, but there's something which is bothering me all the time. If Africa was the mother of civilization, then these guys learned it from us. The Jews was they came twice. Abraham went there, Joseph went there, Christ went there. People came, the Christianity, as you mentioned, aptly, that they came to Africa before advent of Europeans. Then it may beg the question, the African beliefs, therefore, could have influenced them. And then they took it all the way through Roman, Greece to London. Then they bring it back to us, and it tickled our memories to the extent that we say, hey, we better remember. To the extent that, as you rightly say, maybe is counter imperial memory imposed on us. And therefore, parallelism may be necessary in order to maybe arrive at the ecumenism of some type of some syncretic thoughts within the human race, which is now globalized. I just wanted to make that. It could be part of this quest for a bigger being, a higher authority, and knowing that I think the Jews, they call it salvation history. It's not history. It's salvation history. So we are just positioning, just opposing history, pure history, and salvation history, which to them is the God walking through them throughout history, and also our own, maybe our own thinking as Africans, who are part of that histories and our own history. So I think it's a bigger picture in terms of the human quest for the higher being. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. This is, opens quite an area for further research and scrutiny and the kind of discourse that we are having. And Mzee and the rest who are here and those following us online, this is what this forum is meant for. Ongoing research, interrogating issues that we ordinarily don't talk about. And if we do it in hushed tones. In the early 90s, I was doing my research on Hindu social religious organizations in Kenya. And I lived in a temple, partook of their fire sacrifice, the yachna, and took prasad, the equivalent of the Christian sacrament. And the elders in my church were worried about my Christian standing then. And then when I came back and was a little bit interrogated, I said, I've become a better Christian by studying a bit of Hinduism. Yes, Godfrey, patriarchy, and how it shapes our appropriation of reality. But then in the paper, you and I are going to present on Women on Top on 1st December. We are presenting an antithesis to that, how women have ingeniously reinvented themselves to confront patriarchy, which is misogynic and objectifies women and paternalistically controls them. But then women have developed ingenious ways of going around it, and history is replete with examples. So say if you find time, 1st December, we'll be tackling that in the same room with my friend here. Now, I think Godfrey, you've started a conversation that very well confronts the tragedy of a single story. I'm taking a clue from the Nigerian author Chamananda, who talks about the tragedy of a single story. And one space where we have been fed quite a lot on a single story is the Christian spaces. And probably is high time we started interrogating this and confronting the situations and asking new questions to all phenomena that we have had all the time. And you have started as well. And we hope in the next semester, the upcoming series of seminars, we can carry on this. I think we can go on for long, but we will have to stop here because we want to get to other businesses. And I want to welcome the lady who presented last week when you were supposed to present to give a vote of thanks. Christine Boke, please come. We have a mic.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to be very brief so that I don't dilute the amount of knowledge that we have gathered this evening. My name is Christine Boke from the Department of History and Archaeology. As Dr. has said, I was your presenter last week for those who had time to attend. And I'd love to really thank Dr. Godfrey Sang for the very informative talk we've had this evening. We've had a chance to remind ourselves of the African civilization, especially our religious practices, in this case among the Kalenjin. We look forward to reading your paper and especially discovering more on the issues that you did not get time to discuss. I know you had so many other ideas to put across, but because of the constraints of time, you are not able to tell us everything. We thank all of us who are able to attend this evening. They say time is money, and for you to spare some of your money and share it with us, we really need to appreciate. And to Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, who is our chair at the Department of History, we are grateful for this platform that you have given us to be able to engage historically and also interdisciplinary. Today we had a chance to learn about theology or religious studies, and we are able to know how to blend those disciplines and produce something that is harmonious. So thank you so much. I think we are free to engage further. Yes.
So because you stood in on my behalf, you will be the winner of the Paul Boyer book, yeah, which I had promised. Because I had gone to launch it, and it's right next to you. Maybe I can present it to you. Okay. Yeah. I'd gone to launch that book, and you stood in for me, and now you have the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I did not take the bullet in vain. I'm delighted that I live here with a gift. Nice evening, everyone.